Hello, everyone. This is my introduction to today's podcast edition of Listening to America. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. I wanted to say a little bit about this. So on the day or two before the election, we recorded a podcast, but we did not air it. The election was so decisive, and we both I was more pessimistic than she was, but we both thought probably that Kamala Harris would win. I wasn't particularly surprised when Donald Trump won. I was a little surprised that he won the popular vote. I was a little surprised that he won all of the battleground states. So we decided not to air that program. We will put it on. We're rebuilding the 1776 Cup. We're going to call it by a different name, but there's going to be extra content. There's going to be premium content. There will be quarterly Zoom meetings with Lindsay and members of whatever the 1776 Club is named. So this kind of content will be going on this site, and we'll also have, what Rush Limbaugh called a ditto cam. So at times you'll get to see the sausage being made with Lindsay at one end of the country, and I'll be at the other end, and so on and so forth. So I hope you'll want to sign up for that. This is a way to fund the program. It won't be terribly expensive, but I want you to do that. So this program, today's program with Lindsay, is the next one. So we put the other one on the shelf, and this is our first conversation after the election. So the first 14 minutes, the first segment is about that, trying to assess that. Where are we? What happened here? How should we begin to think about this? And then the second two go back historically to look at transitions and preparation. So how did George Washington know how to be president of the United States? Then how did John Adams know what the next president should do? Do you keep the cabinet? Do you change the cabinet? What is the transition like? How much conversation did Adams and Washington have about the transition? And then to Jefferson in 1800. So we talk about all of this, and we hone in a little bit on Chris Christie's attempt to provide the transition materials for Donald Trump in 2016. And Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, actually took all those giant 3-ring binder notebooks of this assiduously gathered material, vetted possible cabinet appointees, and there are literally thousands of people appointed by the President of the United States, and Christie had done as masterful a job with a team of people as could possibly be done. And Kushner threw all of those notebooks into a dumpster. I mean, just tossed them. And to use a Shakespearean line, and hark what discord followed, that the president-elect and then president, Donald Trump, appointed to key jobs some people who were not fit for it, who were beset with scandals, who failed him in different ways, who failed the country in different ways. And so this is an important program about what happens after the election is known. In this case, we knew on the night of November 5th that Donald Trump had been reelected to the presidency. There was no crisis of legitimacy. He won fair and square. Nevertheless, that's just the beginning of a peaceful transfer of power. Now there needs to be cooperation between those leaving and those coming in on questions of international diplomacy, on questions of the economy, energy policy, etc. And so how well are we doing in that regard? And we wanted to provide some historical background to all of that. And the answer is that a systematic transfer of power, transition from one administration to the next, is relatively recent. It was codified in law in 1963 with the Presidential Transition Act, and there have been some updates on it since, and Lindsay makes the case that we need some more. At any rate, it was a really interesting program, and it's great to be back in conversation with Dr. Chervinsky. I hope you're enjoying this. And one of the things we said, and this sounds like, pie in the sky, but people love what we're doing. They love the chemistry that Lindsay and I have, different gender, different generation, different loyalties. My loyalty is fundamentally to Jefferson. Her loyalty is fundamentally not. Let's put it that way. And so this makes for good conversation, because if we agreed, it would be less interesting and less important, because we need a really rigorous debate about this country and leadership and the presidency and the Constitution and the functions of the three branches of the national government and the role of the states and so on. And Lindsay and I seldom really disagree, but we often have a different perspective. And so I'd like to make that bigger. If we'd love to have marketing money. If we had $500,000 a year, I think we could make this program go viral and have millions of listeners rather than hundreds of thousands. That's my goal. She's going to be a very big figure in American historiography, already is at a very young age. It's a pleasure to know her. It's a pleasure to work with her. It's lots of fun, too. And we've never been in the same room, but I think I know her because she's on the screen on the Zoom meeting that we have, and it's fun to watch her facial reactions and grimaces when I say two friendly things about the third president of the United States, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. So, frankly, I think that the Christmas program is a wonderful program. This year, you will have heard it by now, I think. The New Year's program, I think, is one of the most important programs we've ever done. And this is now about transition to power. So thank you, everyone. And we're looking for lots of input, your questions, your comments, your thoughts, your contributions, whatever you can do. This is a renewed center of my existence, and I so appreciate all of you. So let us go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. Across from me, virtually at least, is Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, now the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon, the author of 2 books and more coming. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. It's been a little bit.
It has been a little. Now, I should say to our listeners that we did record a program on the eve of the election. We've decided to hold it for a while and see how everything shakes out. I think it's going to prove to be an interesting set of comments that we made, but we'll leave it at that for the moment. That's why people haven't heard from you for a while. So the election is over, and the result is, I think, pretty interesting, Lindsay, because all of the battleground states went to Donald Trump. He won the popular vote. He won the Electoral College. There's no dispute about the results of the election. There are no lawsuits. There's Kamala Harris conceded, et cetera, et cetera. And so a constitutional or even worse crisis that some of us predicted, if she won, has not come about, and there will be something like a peaceful transfer of power on the 20th of January, 2025. Interesting.
It is. You know, I have a couple of comments based on that. One is I was listening to James Carville a lot prior to the election, and this is James Carville of It's Not the Economy, It's the Economy Stupid fame. And he was saying that in most elections, all the swing states are more likely to go one direction than they are to split. And that is what happened here, which I thought was really interesting because I think most people were predicting a split, and obviously that didn't occur. The second piece that I want to note, and it's sort of an embedded assumption in what you said, but I do think it's worth acknowledging, is if Harris had won, there was an expectation that the transition would not be peaceful and that there would be contested elections and there was concerns about violence. And because Trump won, none of those expectations are there. I think that is worth noting and is not great for democracy that peaceful transitions only exist when one party wins.
I couldn't agree more. I had the chance to interview David Gregory in Vail, and weeks before the election, I said, if Kamala Harris wins, I suppose there will be a peaceful and cheerful transfer of power. And the whole audience erupted into laughter because nobody expected that if Donald Trump had lost. So that's one thing. I'll say this too. People, of course, have been asking you about this. Media has been asking you about this. We're all talking about it in our inner circles. Everyone is kind of wringing their hands and trying to figure out what this portends. But I say to my friends who are deeply concerned, as I think all of us are, elections matter. The election matters. The people spoke. The people know who Donald Trump is. He made no attempt to hide what his plans are for this country. We've had 6 or 7 years to get to know him, his style, his pronouncements, his refusal to live according to the norms. And the people put him back into power. The second president to have that option, Grover Cleveland, was the first. The people have spoken, and we need to understand that that's how democracy works. Now, we can critique the place of money in democracy and social media in democracy and outside interference and so on and so forth. But you will agree, I know, that this is an election. Elections matter. Now we see what comes next.
I mostly agree with that. I mean, obviously, yes, I think elections matter. And I think in some ways, in terms of trust in institutions, it was helpful that the popular vote and the Electoral College vote went in the same direction. But I think I've been listening to a lot of focus groups with voters, I guess, as a penance for my sins or something. One of the things that's really interesting, one of the takeaways of people, especially voters who perhaps voted for Biden in 2020 and then voted for Trump this time, is how many of them didn't vote for him because of what he said on the campaign. How many of them either hadn't heard a lot of the things that he said. So they were voting really based on how their wallets and their bank accounts felt 5 years ago compared to today. Or in spite of some of the things that he said, they said, well, there were a lot of voters that said, oh, I really don't like him, but either maybe I like some of the people he's going to bring in, or I really want to go back to where it was. Or lastly, a lot of people who just think that it's talk. A lot of voters dismiss some of the things that he said and think, oh, well, it's just campaign rhetoric. And like, for example, a lot of voters think that Project 2025 was campaign rhetoric. And yet most of the authors of that program, of that, mega sort of pamphlet, are going to be in the administration. And so to me, it does say a lot, and it says a lot about democracy, and it says a lot about what we need to learn about how people are taking on information. But I'm not necessarily sure that it says that people have bought in completely to what I think of as the Trump platform.
Agreed. Of course, I agree with that. On the other hand, this would be true in 1968, 1946. In other words, what Rush Limbaugh used to call low information voters have always existed. And Carville was certainly right when he said it's the economy, stupid. And people are not following along the way you do as a historian, or way lovers of current event commentary do. Most people are living their lives. They have some impressions. And America is a place that forgets quickly. And so I do think that millions of Americans sort of forgot the Trump years because there had been 4 years after it, and so on. So I agree with you, but I also don't want the Democrats or the losers of the election to try to find a self-soothing narrative. The fact is they lost. And if anyone in the country doesn't know that Donald Trump has said that he will detain and deport millions of undocumented workers, that he will finish the wall, that he will end the war in Ukraine within a few weeks, that he is going to eliminate the Department of Education, that he's going to clean out the sort of hidebound bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., the people that might try to prevent the revolution that he's intending. If anyone doesn't know that, then they're not good citizens. I think one of the things that I come away with in this election, I'm sorry to say, is that Jefferson may have been wrong. He believed that the people were up to it, that they would discern the situation and make choices. And if the people voted for Donald Trump because they want his world, I'm happier with that in a way than if they were so disconnected from all that's going on that they just voted their pocketbook, because that suggests that they're not doing their work as citizens.
I agree. I think one of the big takeaways is just the amount of information that's not getting to people, the amount of, we obviously knew that the media ecosystem was fractured and that people were getting their information from a lot of different places. But it is amazing how much information is not reaching people from an education perspective, from a civics perspective, from a history perspective. I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to grapple with, is how do you get information to people? Especially, as you said, if they have a lot of other things going on, if they're very busy, if life has a lot of demands on a lot of us. And so that's one of the things that I'm kind of mulling over for the next, I don't know, however long.
It was said that the 2024 election was the most important in our lifetime. Some people said the most important in our history. I'm revising that a little. I think the 2026 midterms are going to be among the most important in our history, because either the people are going to affirm the program, which is largely going to be derived from Project 2025, and it's a radical program, whether you're on board with it or not, or they're going to repudiate it in the way that most administrations are repudiated in midterm elections. So if the Senate went to the Democrats, especially in large numbers in 2026, if the House went to the Democrats in large numbers in 2026, that would be a correction of the people of what they would regard as the excesses of the second term of Donald Trump. But if as might well happen, that his approach is affirmed by larger majorities in the Senate and the House, then that tells us who we are, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I think it will suggest a lot about just how much people are willing to tolerate, maybe for potentially lower prices, although I'm not sure we're actually going to get that. So it's going to be very interesting to see, I think, both how much of what Trump said he was going to do he actually does. That's always, all presidents say they're going to do, let's say, 10 things. No one ever does the 10 things. So I'm not suggesting that in not completing his task list, he would be an aberration, but what of the promises he keeps, what the impact of that is, and then how people feel about it.
Agreed. So there are some promises that you can keep quite easily. I'll have an executive order on day one that says that we are going to close our ports to certain types of import-export companies. But if you say I'm going to lower grocery prices, That's a tough thing to make happen. The economy is not controlled by the White House. Presidents claim success when the economy is good. Then they say it's not my fault. These things are way beyond my paycheck when the economy goes bad. But generally speaking, people vote their pocketbook. So we have this strange phenomenon in which the stock market and the economy are booming from a certain point of view, but the cost of living, and believe me, I have felt it buying groceries around Thanksgiving and around Christmas. It is tight, and people don't like it, and they want someone to blame, and they're not going to blame the post-pandemic supply side issues, and they're not going to blame international disruptions. They're going to blame whoever is in power. The question is, will the Trump world be able to deliver on that campaign promise? And if it doesn't, another question I have is, will he be held accountable, or will people say, well, that's because of Biden? I mean, he did his best.
Yeah, I also think some of it to a certain extent is like a sales job. Presidents are really one of their roles, and this is part of the presidency that's so interesting because none of this is written in the Constitution, of course. But a president, in order to be successful, really has to be a good communicator. They really have to be a good salesman. And that doesn't have to look necessarily the same. The way FDR was a salesman was not the same way that Ronald Reagan was a salesman, of course. But they have to be able to sell a vision and sell a theory behind what they're doing. And for all that they did do to improve the economy in certain ways, including incredible investment in manufacturing, most of which is going into red states, a lot of chip infrastructure, infrastructure more broadly, a lot of things that were really important for the economy, they never sold it. And, the one thing they did was to call it Bidenomics, before convincing people that was a good thing. And so, sort of media 101 is you convince people it's a good thing and then you claim credit for it. You don't claim credit for it and then hope they think it's a good thing. And so I think where Trump often succeeds is he is a much better salesman, and he'll go out and say it's the best economy in the world and I created it and it's my responsibility. And of course, a lot of that is hogwash, but if people believe it, then he's done that part of the job well.
Agreed. I think it's fair to say that the Biden administration did a terrible job with the narrative on almost every front, and that historians will wonder how things could have been done in ways that really did affect the economy and American social life for the good can have been so poorly narrated and defended during those 4 years. And that's not just on Joe Biden, that's on the Democrats generally. So they have some work to do. And you'd think in an age when you spend $4 billion on an election, you'd have some people that know how to tell stories and how to shape narratives. But it's a shocking failure, I think, of the party and of President Biden himself. Clearly, his age is a factor here. Now, we got to take a break here. We've gotten this on and off the table. This is our first chance face-to-face to talk about the election and to try to provide some clarity about it. And my takeaway is elections matter. And I think your takeaway is we still don't quite know what happened in terms of what trickled down into people's votes, but we will continue to examine that. When we come back, I want to go back to history. I want to talk about transfer of power and transitions, and what an incoming president needs to do to be ready on day one. We'll see you in just a moment. This is a special edition of Listening to America. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm talking with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, one of my favorite guests. In fact, we had a conversation the other day in the insiders in the LTA world, and everyone said, more Lindsay, more Lindsay. And you're seeing it on your side. I think you told me that every time you give a reading or you give a lecture now, somebody comes up and says, hey, I hear you on Listening to America. So what a wonderful symbiosis this is.
Oh, it's absolutely fantastic. What I said was, I did all of these book events all over the country, and I did not attend a single one where someone did not come up and say how much they enjoyed listening to us. And so that was just incredibly heartwarming and so gratifying to meet people in person. And, I've said this before, but when the cabinet came out, it was 3 weeks into the pandemic. And so I didn't get to meet readers in person for over a year. And to be able to do that right away and to see the expanded networking community because of the podcast that we have done was just really amazing. And so I'm so grateful to everybody who does listen and everyone who did come out and we got to meet in person. And Clay and I are working on some in-person activities together, same place, same time.
Stay
Who
tuned.
knew? So yes, that will be really fun. And we hope the room is packed with listeners.
And Lindsay, not to be begging, but if someone would just give us a ton of money for marketing, we could really build this thing, because I think the chemistry between us works for people. I think the generational difference, the gender difference, that you're East Coast establishment, I'm some guy from the prairie. We're both smart Alex, but in different styles. You have slang, which makes me shiver and blush, but you seem to be perfectly happy with it, and so do your readers and listeners. So if someone needs to give us $500,000 for 5 years, and we will rock the world, James Carville, you will finally retire, buddy.
And if anyone has a private plane that they would like to lend us, we can just hopscotch everywhere and do events for everyone at all times.
You know, we had them until you had to bring up the jet. All right. So let's talk about history. So a president is elected. This election was known on day one. On November 5th, we went to bed knowing. In fact, when the first returns came in at about 5 p.m. Central Time, I thought, he has won this election. And no part of me thought that she was going to pull it out. So now, during the interim, it used to be from November or the fall all the way to March 4th. That was changed in the 20th century. But the president-elect has to get ready. Let's talk about it historically. So everyone knew George Washington would be the first president, and he was. He's the only unanimously chosen president in the Electoral College in American history. He knew what to do, of course. He had been preparing for leadership all of his life, and he also had the advantage of almost every person of great respectability in the country admired him. He had very few true detractors amongst what we would call the establishment class. So how did Washington prepare to be president?
Well, it's really interesting how you set that up, because he, on one hand, you're right, he had so much leadership experience. Almost no one could have had more, or I would argue even better leadership experience. But on the other, the presidency was a total question mark, because if we looked at what Article 2 said, it's very short. Very little is written down. And even though Washington sat in on the Constitutional Convention and was there every single day, so he had a very clear sense of what the delegates had expected of him, there were so many details that they intentionally left for him to figure out, because they either didn't have time, or they were tired and grouchy and they wanted to leave, or they just weren't sure. They couldn't come to a compromise. And so they figured, well, he'll deal with it and establish a trustworthy precedent.
Yeah, or they thought, it's Washington. He'll put in the details. We don't need to. It's Washington.
It'll be fine. And so things like, can the president socialize with friends? And if so, in what capacity? And Washington did have an active social life. So could he go to friends' houses? Could he have them to his house? Could he go to the theater? He loved the theater. Could he, how should he interact with citizens if he met them on the streets? There were just so many details that he was not sure about. And he wrote on his way to the inauguration that he felt like a prisoner going to the place of execution. And that is not the sentiment we typically associate with an inauguration, but I think it really does get at what he was feeling, which is that he knew how much was weighing on him, how every decision would make a precedent for those that followed. And the way that he prepared was trying to ensure that the people around him were the very possible best that he could have. And while he didn't know exactly what the departments were going to look like, he did know that they were going to exist in some capacity, because there were existing and acting departments under the Confederation Congress. So he started to select advisors to think about the people that would have different experience and knowledge from his own, and perhaps be able to think outside of the box in a way that he was not able to, which is how he eventually selected Hamilton, Jefferson, Henry Knox as the Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as the Attorney General.
So a couple of things about that. First of all, what an astonishing sentence to be issued from the pen of George Washington, that he felt like some pickpocket or culprit on his way to a public execution as he assumed the presidency of the United States. When you first read that, you can't even believe that George Washington said that, but he did. And so I just love that. I mean, I was going to mention it if you didn't. I'm so glad that you did. Also, the cabinet. So today there are 15 cabinet officers. As you say, they're not in the Constitution. The Constitution does not say there shall be a cabinet of advisors. We'll come back to the exact language here in a moment. Then there were really 4: War, Attorney General, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. And the Attorney General didn't even need to be full-time. He was just like on call as a legal advisor to the administration. So here's the actual language from the Constitution of the United States, from which the cabinet and presumably your own fine book emerge. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, that the president, quote, can require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. He can require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject, etc. So clearly, the Constitution makers realized the president would have to have a team of department heads. They didn't specify what those department heads were, but they assumed that, of course, there would be somebody to handle the Treasury. Of course, there would be somebody whose primary portfolio would be what we call defense or war. So they didn't have to lay it all out, but it was Washington himself who decided what sort of range of different types of expertise he needed. And one of the things that's most interesting to me as a Jefferson scholar is that the Secretary of State was meant to have a much larger portfolio than he or she currently has. And Jefferson didn't want to take that role for a number of reasons, one of which was he thought it was too big a portfolio. It involved patents and foreign policy and a range of other things. And Jefferson thought, it's like that's the prime minister, and I don't want to be a prime minister. Give me a portfolio that has some very limited definition. And so the Secretary of State was the most amorphous, I think, of the early cabinet choices. Washington chose well with Jefferson. I think, aside from Jefferson's disloyalty at times in the cabinet of George Washington, he was a masterful Secretary of State.
Yeah, he was. And, one of the things about the Secretary of State position that we don't always necessarily think about today is because of the limitations of travel and communication. So how long it took for news to get from, let's say, the United States to places like Greece or Algeria. They also had to oversee a system of networks of consuls. And these consuls were people who were living in those places. They were often not paid for the work, and they were in charge of being the point person for Americans that were coming through or passing through or got into trouble. So sailors were captured in some way. They were responsible for getting them back. And all of those people reported back to the Secretary of State. The State Department today is huge, but it's also very hierarchical, and it's sort of very clear what the networks of communications were. The State Department was, at least the department that was actually in Philadelphia, was really quite small. And so there was a lot of random networks of communications that had to be monitored. And that was a lot of the stuff that took up most of Jefferson's time.
Formal and informal. And when he was effectively the ambassador to France between 1784 and 1789, he's always giving small loans to people who are in distress. He's helping people sort out whether they can bring their enslaved people into France and still keep them as enslaved people. And so this is a very amorphous sort of business, worldwide diplomacy. And in Jefferson's time, at least, most of the people were not formal employees of the United States government. They had some sort of a quasi-informal relationship with the administration.
And all of this is being done sort of haphazardly. Legislation monitoring the consuls and sort of shaping what they were supposed to do was not passed for quite some time. So not only was Jefferson figuring this out on the fly, but Washington was figuring this out on the fly, which is, for me, when people talk about the Constitution and they treat it as though it was written in 1787 and it hasn't changed since, I have trouble not laughing in their faces, because so much of the reality of governing was an evolution in response to real-time challenges and doing the very best that they could to do something that was sensible and feasible given the constraints of the moment.
Right. I dare say, Lindsay, that of the 15 cabinet ministers of the Biden administration, not one of them is likely to be kept on by Donald Trump.
Certainly not the cabinet positions. The only administrator that I think potentially could stay on is Lena Khan, who's the head of the Federal Trade Commission. And that's because she has been pretty strong on antitrust positions and has therefore sort of a weird overlap where some people like J.D. Vance, sort of in that tradition that are sort of anti-monopoly, as well as people like Bernie Sanders, they kind of overlap enough to support what she's doing. And so Trump has said some positive things about her. I think Vance has said some positive things about her, but that is the only one that I think is possible that might stay.
And I should say, this is not just Donald Trump. It's routine now that a different party comes to power. Cabinet goes, almost no one has ever kept. Once in a while, a president picks somebody from the other party or keeps somebody on, but it's atypical. So this was not necessarily known then. And of course, this is one of your main points, that when John Adams came to power, second president following the great one, the legend, the myth in his own life, George Washington, he had to decide, do I start over? Do I keep everybody? Do I keep some or get rid of others? What's my duty to Washington? What's my duty to the Constitution? I've got to fill these offices with able people. He was in a kind of a pickle, wasn't he?
He was, and I think that either way, it was really between a rock and a hard place, because if he adhered too closely to Washington's model, of course, he was going to be accused for, criticized for not being Washington. And if he diverged, he was going to be criticized for diverging from Washington's model. So there was no winning in this situation. And what's remarkable about Adams is that he knew that and was willing to do it anyway.
Today, when a president-elect emerges, he or eventually she travels to the White House and meets with the sitting president, and there's some sort of a advisory meeting. And famously, Barack Obama told President-elect Trump that North Korea was going to be the big issue of his administration. Turns out it wasn't really. What was the interplay between Washington and Adams after the results of the 1796 election were known?
Almost nothing. So they did have a meaningful, deep conversation in the spring of 1796 before Washington had actually made his announcement. And it's notable because Adams wrote in a letter back to Abigail that it was the only time they had really spoken deeply about anything, which is a pretty remarkable statement. Once the election was clear, they talked very little. And, Martha Washington at one point said that they were very happy with the outcome, but that was the extent of their commentary. And, so Washington didn't give Adams briefings. He didn't, that we know of. There's no record that he gave him substantive information about what was going on, about what he should do with the cabinet members, anything like that. They saw each other regularly, sometimes up to 3 times per week, but they didn't talk about anything. And so Adams was coming in with a limited set of knowledge about both what was happening within the cabinet, but also what was happening in the world.
My sense of it, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is that when Washington was finally allowed to retire, he wanted to go sit under his fig tree and with his vines, and he moved away fast and washed his hands of the whole thing, essentially.
Well, I think there are 3 possible explanations for why he didn't give Adams more substantive advice or be more interactive in the transition process. The first is that he was tired, that he had wanted to leave 4 years earlier. I don't blame him for any of that. He had been away from Mount Vernon for 8 years during the war. There was a lot of public service there. The second possible explanation is that he didn't want to interfere, that he thought it would be inappropriate and it would make it more difficult for Adams to be president if Washington interfered, because he understood that Adams had to kind of be his own man and it was going to be very hard to be president after Washington.
So a kind of 18th century deference, that a true principled civility, that it's now time for me to withdraw and to let the new president govern the country according to his own style.
Yes. And we do see a little bit in that tradition. Now there's an expectation most of the time that former presidents don't talk about politics once they've left office. That is the expectation, that the person in office is going to have a hard enough time without the former person meddling. So that is certainly possible for part of it. The last part of it is that he maybe just didn't really trust John Adams all that much, and he didn't really trust his political judgment, and he didn't really want a whole lot to do with him, and he thought that he could kind of shape the outcomes by encouraging his existing secretaries to stay in office, which he did do, and that would be sufficient. I suspect it's a combination of all 3.
Well done, thank you. But his cabinet ministers, those 4, typically wrote to Alexander Hamilton with their concerns, complaints, and alternative views of America, not to the former president. There was some correspondence between George Washington and these cabinet secretaries, but their primary loyalty was to Washington as a kind of a symbol of everything right with America, the way Republicans today talk about Ronald Reagan, maybe. But the evil genie, or the active mind behind them, was Hamilton.
Yes, with a caveat. So Charles Lee was the attorney general. Because the Lee family in Virginia were very quirky, they were Federalists, but they were not sort of the arch Federalists of the Pickering-Hamilton model. And they were very loyal to Washington, but they were also very independent-minded. And so Charles Lee actually became quite a good attorney general for Adams because he resented the expectation that he would be a party man. He, again, brought that independent spirit. So he's sort of an exception to the rule. And because he was a Virginian, he was then very close with John Marshall, who at halfway through Adams' presidency came into Congress and was an ally. And so he sort of formed this other little nucleus. The secretaries did write to Washington when it suited them. So Pickering wrote a bunch of letters complaining about Adams to Washington when he was trying to shift Washington's thinking about a various different moment or something that Adams had done. But by and large, when they were looking for strategic advice, you're right, they were absolutely going to Hamilton. They were not going to Washington.
You would think that an outgoing president would want to, of course, be gracious and defer to the incoming one. On the other hand, no one in the whole world has more experience than the one who just left that office. And we might have done this in a different way if Washington hadn't been so careful about this. When Jefferson left office in 1808, left in 1809, election of 1808, he made a big Jeffersonian deal out of not meddling and deferring, and no, it's your time now, and I will, you know how Jefferson is, high-minded right to the nth degree about things like this. Did that precedent that Washington set in 1797, how serious was that as precedent that the outgoing president tries not to meddle?
Really depends on the person. Herbert Hoover in 1932 did everything he could to scuttle the New Deal promises that FDR had made coming into office and to try and convince FDR to abandon those promises. Now, once FDR was in office, there wasn't really anything Hoover could do, obviously, because he was out and had no power. I think there are a couple of examples where presidents have offered to help, and it depends on the person that's coming into office whether or not they take them up on that. So, after his resignation, Nixon was actually a pretty important foreign policy advisor for Presidents Clinton and others, especially when it came to things like China. And I think it's actually a little bit of a redemption moment because often his advice was quite savvy. Another example is JFK, when he was coming into office, was really quite dismissive of Eisenhower. He thought he was sort of old and doddery and no longer with it and didn't understand the world. And then the Bay of Pigs happened, and he started consulting with Eisenhower quite regularly and realized how savvy Eisenhower still was. I think it really does depend on the personalities involved, what their relationships are like, and what their strengths and weaknesses were as president.
A couple of things. First of all, Eisenhower was pretty patronizing towards Jack Kennedy, treated him like some kid who really wasn't ready for the office and was very hard on him. Then there is Theodore Roosevelt. When he left office in 1909, having handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft, he went on a year-long safari in Africa. And he said he did it because he didn't want Taft to be looking over his shoulder all the time, and he didn't want the press to be looking over Taft's shoulder at Theodore Roosevelt. When I sometimes give lectures about this, I say, as Roosevelt, imagine following me. And so Roosevelt got out of the country so that poor Taft could have a chance, and then Taft disappointed him, and Roosevelt challenged him.
Grant did a similar thing. Grant did a world tour when he left the presidency.
That's cool. We need to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about transition teams. You're listening to a special edition of our podcast, Listening to America, with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, the author of 2 books, the most recent about John Adams. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone. I'm talking to my dear friend, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. We'll soon be sharing a stage in Vail, Colorado, and then we're doing one in Virginia later in the spring. We'll get those announcements up so people can come and watch whatever happens between us when we're there in person. I can't wait, actually. It'll be so much fun, and to try to hold my own. So I'm about to interview David Marchik, who is a very interesting political theorist, and he has a book on transfer of power, in which he interviewed a number of individuals from our own time. And the one that I found most interesting, Lindsay, was Chris Christie, who was asked by Donald Trump when he won the 2016 election, and Trump didn't really expect to win it, I don't think, but then he asked Christie, his friend, sort of a rival, but mostly a friend then, to handle the transition. And Christie took it very, very seriously. He assembled a large team of experts. They vetted a whole range of people for different offices, because there are thousands of people that the president must appoint. And they had different 3-ring binders for every cabinet department. And I mean, this was done as well as this can be done for the incoming president, Donald Trump. And according to Christie himself, when Jared Kushner began to do the actual process of the transition, he took all of those 3-ring binders and threw them in a dumpster. And Christie has never gotten over that, of course. Why should he? And because of that, because Trump wouldn't listen to an expert of that capacity, whatever you think of Chris Christie, he is one of the major figures in American governance. Not listening to him put Trump in a very difficult spot because he appointed a very large number of people who turned out not to be fit for that office, and he didn't let the experts guide him. So that's recent, isn't it? I mean, Jefferson didn't have a team of people looking at the transition. In fact, when he won the election of 1800, it was contested, and it wasn't until 36 ballots in the House of Representatives, it was just a couple of weeks before he had to take the oath of office. He sort of knew that Madison was going to be his Secretary of State and Gallatin was going to be his Secretary of the Treasury. He hired Meriwether Lewis to become his private secretary, but he didn't have a transition team. Things were a little simpler then, and of course Jefferson's a genius, so he doesn't necessarily need it in the same way that a regular old president would. But when, to your knowledge, when did the tradition begin of having a team of advisors to think about the transition from the moment the election was decided or even before?
So I think that it was a sort of haphazard process depending on the person. So for example, we were just talking about Eisenhower. When Eisenhower won, his victory in the general election was very much to be expected after he had won the primary, because the primary is quite contested. It wasn't decided until the convention. It was between him and Robert Taft, who was sort of a hardline isolationist on the right-hand side of the party. And he had a group of guys that sort of served as his campaign managers. And he basically handed the transition over to them and allowed them to pick the cabinet people after giving feedback on what he wanted and who was important to him. And so that's one example of how it worked in the past. Abraham Lincoln had campaign people that helped him, but then he was quite meticulous and he had different advisors within the various wings of this new Republican Party, but he was quite meticulous about making sure that he sought out different leaders from different factions to pull together his famous team of rivals. Official team that Dave Marchick is talking about, and by the way, he's the very best. Please give him my regards. I think very highly of him. The official teams started with the Presidential Transition Act of 1963. And that provided for sort of an official start date for when this process is supposed to begin. And this was largely because presidents and president-elects were beginning to understand that the amount of work that they had to do was not feasible between November and January. You couldn't do it in that amount of time. But if you started doing it beforehand, Americans would feel like you were measuring the drapes before you actually won the White House. And so by providing for this mandated legal process, it was giving people cover to start to do the transition work that was required. And that's when they started to put together official teams, because it gave you funding, it gave you office space to conduct this work, it set out when certain things had to be decided by, and it gave you a staff to start to vet potential candidates for the thousands upon thousands of appointees that the president actually has to appoint. There are thousands of political appointees in our system, which sets us apart from other governments around the world in which you have far fewer political appointees. And that's why their transitions are often much shorter. So the Presidential Transition Act has been amended over the last several decades to try and close loopholes, to add additional funding, to expand the process, to require certain briefings to begin by certain things. There are still improvements that I think could be made. So for example, we saw in 2020 what the holdup for the official transition process was that the administrator of the General Services Administration is the one that starts the certification, saying, yes, hand over these funds. Yes, hand over these offices. Yes, begin the official briefings and security clearance background checks. That person is a political appointee. And that person in 2020 was reluctant to cross Trump in the event that he would potentially do something to her job. And so she didn't want to start the process. I would say, let's take that decision out of the hands of a political appointee to streamline and to protect the people who are making those decisions.
So a couple of things about that, Lindsay. So the Transition Act, and there were a series of them now, were passed to make sure there's continuity in government, that the incoming people know what they need to know about situations at home and around the world. There's so much at stake. The sense is that maybe there wasn't so much at stake in 1799, but there is so much at stake in the 21st century that it would be ruinous to have discontinuities in the governance of the United States. And so this is designed to create the smoothest possible transition from one administration to the next. But if you are a known disruptor, if your whole plan is to disrupt and create a populist revolution, as Donald Trump does, and I'm not criticizing him for that, then you don't necessarily want that process, because that process is designed to preserve a kind of conservative continuity in government, and maybe you want to make a fundamental break with the past. And so he has famously resisted all of that as much as he possibly can. And I don't know what the feeling is inside Washington at the moment about the transition, but I'm sure that it's shocking. That's one thing. Secondly, not all administrations are friendly to the incoming administration. Sometimes in outgoing administrations, people stall. They refuse to provide certain information. It's amazing how petty things can be in a nation of this global importance.
Yes, to your first point, I think the transition process is to ensure that people are as prepared, responsible, and qualified to lead the departments. That's not necessarily Trump's goal.
Right.
In several cases, it's quite clear that he is looking for people who will disrupt and at times, I would say, dismantle certain executive offices. So that's a very different set of goals and aspirations coming into a transition process.
And he's entitled to that view, even though you and I may think from a historical point of view it's dangerous, but he's entitled to that view of government.
I would say that he's entitled to it. I would say that it is also very important that the Senate has the opportunity to advise and consent on those positions. Now, whether or not they think that constitutional responsibility is important is, I suppose, a different podcast. But that is a part of the constitutional process. George W. Bush, because he had a shorter transition because of Bush versus Gore, the Supreme Court decision, he really felt like he was behind the eight ball and that he didn't have all the information and didn't have the national security people in place. And as a result, that is one of the factors that a lot of experts felt like contributed to the terrorist attacks on 9/11. And so he was determined that the transition from him to Obama, even though they disagreed on almost everything, was going to be as perfect as possible. And he instructed his team to be as helpful as possible to facilitate the briefings and the transitions. And they were incredibly collegial. And Obama instructed his staff to do the same because he recognized the gift that Bush's team had given him. And so presidents who have the long view, who care about the republic above their own partisan grievances, do the same. They understand that this is a moment of weakness for the nation to be in a period of transition, and you want to do everything you can to minimize that weakness.
Absolutely. Very well said. And I want to say, let us now praise George W. Bush, because he has performed with stunning class and civility in that transition, which he wouldn't have had to do. Obama was pretty tough on him on the old campaign trail. And since he left the presidency, he has been exemplary in the caution with which he has weighed in on important public events. There's a real class to the Bushes, whether you agree with their politics or not. And, George W. Bush, in my opinion, was a little underprepared to be president of the United States in 2001, but he grew in life, and particularly at the end of his term, I think. And I think that that's the standard by which I would hope that all presidencies end. And I think you're right that Barack Obama understood what gift he had been given by the outgoing Bush administration, and he then wanted to pass that gift on to a person that, frankly, he thought was wholly unfit for the presidency of the United States, but he was thinking about the president of the United States, not the occupant. Well, let's look at the most disastrous thing that happened during Jefferson's presidency, the Embargo Acts of 1807, 8, and 9, where Jefferson had to assume executive powers that were larger than any previous president, in fact, larger than any subsequent president until Abraham Lincoln. That's number one. And the Embargo Acts were a political disaster. There was widespread smuggling. Jefferson was denounced. Eventually, they had to alter the Embargo Acts, and they expired with the administration. Jefferson's approval rating, if there had been such at the time, would have plummeted. He left office in some disarray over this. He and Madison were following their favorite idea that economic embargo was better than war, and that you could coerce recalcitrant nations with economic pressures and so on. Could this have been prevented? This sounds like Jefferson and Madison having a fixed idea about the possibility of economic coercion and then not letting anybody talk them out of it.
Yeah, I think that that's accurate. I think that part of the problem was that they had such a fixed idea of America's economic influence on the world. They really thought that if they had an embargo and if they pulled these economic levers, it would force the European empires to do what they wanted, which was a gross overstatement of their own importance. And they learned that the hard way. To be fair, not everyone also complied with it because New England was in no way interested in dealing with the embargo, and Jefferson didn't have the domestic force or might to make everyone comply, which would have required an enormous domestic crackdown and would have been even more unpopular. So that part was not totally his fault, but I do think it was an overestimation of their ability to make a change, which is interesting because the same thing I would say happened in the Civil War in the South, whereas the South felt like if they shut off their cotton flows, then it would force Great Britain to come to their aid because the cotton was so important. And instead, Great Britain found other sources of cotton, which is exactly what happened during Jefferson's presidency as well.
So, per that, the embargo was a disaster. But Jefferson's view was it's either war or effective surrender or something else, a tertium quid, a third path. And the third path was going to be economic coercion. As you say, they aggrandized America's economic might and the world's dependency on America's raw materials. But what if you had been advising Jefferson in 1806 and 7 after these things, what would you have suggested they do about this? Jefferson believed we weren't ready to fight a war against Britain and we had better stall.
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I'm not sure there was a great alternative. I don't think crashing the economy was the ideal the ideal solution, but I think he's probably right that the country wasn't ready for war, and certainly there wasn't the same sort of sentiment in favor of it. And the problem was the US just didn't have a whole lot of leverage to force Great Britain to stop impressing its soldiers. And so there just wasn't really anything they could do. So I guess in this instance, I don't know that I necessarily have a better idea other than maybe to ignore it as much as possible.
And remember that Jefferson is a utopian in part, and he actually believed that it was too late in the world's history for war, and that he thought that the people of New England, the shipping industries and so on, would say, we get it, we get it. This will be trouble. This will be trouble. There will be a recession, or the economy will certainly falter, but this is a noble and idealistic alternative to battle. And this is what enlightenment means. So I give Jefferson some credit for this impulse. I think Jefferson always misread human nature, but still, I love this. I love this quality in Thomas Jefferson. Let's just quickly go, we're almost out of time, Lindsay, to the next transition. So Jefferson would have been reelected to a third term in spite of the embargo acts. He retires, saying that Washington had set that precedent, and it was an important one. I love that about Jefferson. Madison is clearly the next president, handpicked. Madison has a problem, in my opinion, but I want your advice about this in just a couple of minutes. So Madison loves Jefferson. If anyone actually loved Jefferson with a full heart and the deepest respect and a kind of almost semi-reverential admiration, it was James Madison. And yet, he knew that Jefferson was sort of a wild card, that Jefferson did all sorts of crazy stuff, that Jefferson, in the heat of the moment, would say things that he would later regret if they became policy. And Madison didn't share Jefferson's view of the country in quite 100%. He wanted to take a sort of a different approach. So he had to do a very interesting thing, didn't he? He had to maintain the deep loyalty to the man, and he meant it, and yet he wanted to break with Jefferson in some ways, but he also knew that Jefferson, in spite of saying that he was done and was just going to, garden at Monticello and study math, that Jefferson was watching everything Madison did. So unpack that just a little bit for us.
This is a subject that has been very much in the news for the last 6 months, that when you are vice president in administration, or in this case, vice president was so irrelevant that, that the Secretary of State was really the number 2. So when you are in someone's administration, it's really hard to both prove loyalty, but also carve out a different path. And Madison was very much in that place. And that was reflected in his choices about the cabinet, that he kept a lot of the same cabinet secretaries, partly because they were the leading voices of the party, of which he was a member as well. But that proved to be highly problematic because he had been sort of first among equals in the cabinet with them and then was elevated. And it is really hard for people sometimes to see a peer all of a sudden become their supervisor, particularly too with Robert Smith, who had been the Secretary of the Navy and caused Madison all sorts of trouble. And the Smith family was very powerful in Republican Party politics. And so he couldn't just get rid of him because Samuel Smith, Robert Smith's brother, was really sort of this power broker within the party. And so He was certainly in some ways, I think, more small c conservative than Jefferson. Certainly when it came to certain policies, he, backtracked from the embargo once it was clear that it wasn't working, but then kind of got boxed in almost to war because there wasn't really any other choice.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think it's gotten insufficient amounts of historical attention. I think being Madison was one of the most difficult roles of the early national period. It's not that Jefferson isn't deeply and fundamentally admirable in so many ways, but Madison is more political than Jefferson, but he doesn't have Jefferson's stature. He doesn't have Jefferson's mythic place in American life. Let me ask you one last very quick question. As you watch the transition that's happening now between the Biden one-term presidency and Trump's second term, how concerned are you about this very set of principles that we've been talking about today? Smooth transition, continuities, expertise being handed on, cooperation between the outgoing and the incoming administration.
Well, I'm not concerned about it being a peaceful transfer of power. I worry a great deal about the transition of expertise because I think some of the candidates have explicit distaste and contempt for some of that expertise and are looking to gut some of the institutions that are really critical to our national security, to the functioning of our system. And I think that a lot of people think that governing is really easy and they think they'll just run it like a business, but the government is not a business. It's not designed to be a for-profit entity, and it is enormously complicated and requires, I think, a great deal of respect, which is not to say that there aren't things that could be improved or made more efficient or waste that could be trimmed. But I don't think that the sort of lackadaisical way that has been approached is fitting with the responsibilities and demands of the federal system. I am concerned in particular about a handful of candidates that are wholly unqualified for the positions that they have been appointed. Not that I have political differences with them, which I do, but that is a president's prerogative. And I worry deeply about our national security in particular, because I think there are a couple of positions in that space that have been selected almost to do harm. And so I worry a great deal about what that will look like for the people who, sacrifice and are willing to risk their lives on behalf of the nation and for our future security going forward.
No, mine. All I can say to that is we'll see what the United States Senate is made of in its sacred purpose of advice and consent about key presidential appointments. Thank you, Lindsay. Wonderful program. So good to see you again. I can't wait to see you on the stage in Vail here shortly. We'll post all of that. But for the rest of you, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.